to the last part of what I wrote about with the missing link. Have anybody heard of the Nebraskan man? The fossil records that they try to say, okay, this is a caveman, this is what we would have looked like. They don't have those bones. A diagram they did of the Nebraskan man back in the 1920s. But they said, this is a caveman, this is what it looked like. He was reconstructed based on a tooth. That's it. They took the tooth to make the jaw, they did the jaw to make the face, they made the face to make the body. That is how they reconstructed Nebraskan man, based upon a tooth in the early 1900s. That's why some people say, well, they're fake bones. Now maybe they've heard that story and that was fabricated, so they think the dinosaurs were fabricated. You got to know the difference. There has been a lot of fabrication of the fossil record. You can't take a tooth and reconstruct a human from it. But that's what they did with the Nebraskan man. This was so widely touted in the science world that who's familiar with the Scopes monkey trial? Okay? That was a trial that happened in 1925 where a teacher was accused. There was a law in Tennessee at the time that you could not teach evolution. You can watch Inherit the Wind, that's the movie about it. But it's part of our Tennessee history. There was a law and there was issues raised about the constitutionality of the law, but they brought him up on charges for teaching evolution. Scopes monkey trial was huge. I think he was found guilty, but then it was overturned on some technicalities and he was never retried. One of the big things they used in his defense was the Nebraskan man. That model of the Nebraskan man. Do you know it was later found out that the tooth that they used to reconstruct the Nebraskan man was from a warthog? Was from a warthog. So, they're desperate to find caveman, the caveman. Lee Strobel writes about Java Man. Have any of y'all heard of Java Man? If you ever go into a museum and you see that parade of like the monkey to the human, Java Man is in there about 2 or 3 in. The jutting jaw and, the kind of like he's going to carry around a club, beat his, drag a woman by the hair or whatever, that kind of thing. That's Java Man. And you can go in some museums and you'll see that ape-like looking head that's supposed to be our evolution between monkey and man, right? That diagram that they did to do Java Man was put together with a skull cap, a femur, and 2 teeth. And now they even think that all of those little samples were from different specimens. So they're desperate. They're desperate to prove what they believe, and they have no proof. Does that kind of make you feel better about the creation and God and everything? Does that kind of help you out a little bit? Yes or no? Everybody? Does that help? Okay. My second question is why did God? He can, make things perfect. Why did He create us to fall? In Genesis, it talks about let us create man in our own image. In the image of God, that means He created us with independent thought. He created a creation to be someone who would love Him out of their own choosing. That, in a nutshell, is the reason for the fall. We fell away because we were created in God's image with independent thought. Only by falling away were we able to choose Him of our own free will to be the creation He wanted in the first place. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And I've got some more that I could talk to you about that, but there's no way we're going to have time. The miracle of the prophecies. If you look at the list of the Messianic prophecies, and I've got you a little section here that's got just about, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 of them. Talking about Him being born in Bethlehem, of the house of David, a ministry preceded by a messenger, betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, silent before His confusers, betrayed by a friend, His hands and feet would be pierced, darkness over the land. It goes on and on and on and on. There were hundreds of prophecies fulfilled in Jesus Christ. This is another calculable odds exercise. John Clayton includes it in his book. A mathematician, Dr. Peter Stoner, had his students take just 8 of the prophecies and calculate the odds of any man being able to fulfill those prophecies and being born. Those odds were 100,000 million millions, and that's just of 8 of the prophecies. So for Christ to have fulfilled just 8 of the prophecies, the odds are again absolutely impossible for Him to have just completed 8 of them. So when you look at the Messianic prophecies, that shows you that Christ was who He says He was, simply from the prophecies. A lot of people, they say, well, when you're reading what you're reading in the New Testament, how do you know this wasn't just a myth written by man? One of the ways that we can look at that is going into the history books and reading what others who were not Christians wrote about Jesus Christ. Know anything about works of antiquity, sometimes a person of history will be known to us simply because he was mentioned one time in an ancient document. Christ, of course, was written extensively about in the New Testament by the Christian writers, but he was also written about by Josephus, a Jewish historian. And he wrote about AD 93, his work, The Antiquities. Josephus was kind of like a Pharisee or a Sadducee. He was like really in good with the rulers, and so he wasn't real loyal to the Jewish people. Some of the things that he says, they said, well, somebody in his position wouldn't have written. It is thought that some of the works of the work of Josephus that as we know it now, was probably tampered with by a Christian scribe. And most people who look at it objectively believe that was probably true. A teacher of men who aptly received the truth and drew to himself many Jews and Greeks too. This man was the Christ. He would not have said this man was the Christ, okay? Because of his position in the government. People will look at this and they'll say, see, there it is. There's somebody fabricating history. But they forget that Josephus also wrote about Jesus' brother. Antiquities 2200, he writes about James and identifies him as the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. That line right there tells you earlier in the Antiquities he had written about Jesus. So it wasn't fabricated that he wrote about Jesus. Maybe he didn't call him the Christ. Maybe he didn't make references to him that would make us think Josephus was a believer. But he obviously wrote about Jesus, or he wouldn't have said James is the brother of Jesus, so-called Christ. In other words, he had already written about Jesus earlier. He didn't have to, reiterate who Jesus was. He also writes about John the Baptist in the Antiquities. In Antiquities 18:5-2, he writes about how that the Jewish people at the time blamed the destruction of Herod's army on retaliation by God for killing John the Baptist. So, at two other sections in Josephus' writing, he writes about things that point back to Christ. So when people try to dismiss that and say, well, that Josephus wouldn't have written that way because he was in with the government, but then you read other sections where he writes about things relating to Christ. Josh McDowell says about that is he says probably what happened is a Christian scribe added those lines to make it sound a little better. He says if you take it out, he says this is more than likely exactly what Josephus wrote. Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians so named are not extinct from this day. They say when you take out the lines that you can tell a Christian probably put in, you get a more accurate look at what Josephus wrote. Christ was written about a lot outside of the New Testament. There's another Roman historian, Tacitus. He wrote about Pilate killing Christ. He writes about a superstition that was repressed for a time and then rose up again that they speculate was probably the resurrection superstition. He wrote in about AD 115. He lived between 55 and 120. So these are historians that were not Christians that wrote about Christ. There's one that I love, Greek satirist Lucian. I kind of think of him like a comedian of the time. He wrote, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it is impressed upon them by the original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. I mean, these are writers that have nothing to do with Christianity, and it's kind of funny because this satirist, he obviously didn't like the Christians. And one of his writings are one of the most profound proofs we have that they were there and that Christ lived. There's a writer, Julius Africanus, that he writes about the darkness that was over the land, how they tried to explain it. When the early Christians came together, they didn't say, hey, let's get out the New Testament. They said, let's get out the memoirs of the apostles. Let's get out the diaries of the apostles and see what they have to say. And what makes them valid is because they were eyewitnesses. Mr. McDowell makes another just profound point to me. He says, when you look at what the eyewitnesses wrote, he said, they were martyred. All except John died in horrific ways. Horrible, horrible ways. He said, they died professing this truth. And you may say, well, people die for a while all the time, but at the time that they die, they believe it's the truth. The apostles worked with Jesus, saw him die on the cross, lived with him after he rose, went to their death declaring that truth. So they died not for a truth that they hoped for, but a truth that they were absolute eyewitnesses to.